the context of the historical events that happened in the Bible, what did the historical Pharisees, Sadducees, and other groups believe? Hello, and welcome to my ex-Christian secular deconstructing Bible study bonanza. I'm here to help you deconstruct. We're talking about the textbook, The New Testament, written by ex-Christian biblical historian Bart Ehrman, and this is part 3 of the 4th chapter. Please come along. As we discussed in part 2 of the 4th chapter, the formation of the groups of Pharisees, Sadducees, Ases, and a fourth unnamed group happened because of the political upheaval of the region and the desire for Jewish people to maintain their distinction as a culture. People were still peopling back then, and many different opinions existed around how best to run things. That's why there were so many Jewish subgroups. Still, as Dr. Ehrman notes, only a small percentage of Jewish people living in the Palestinian region belonged to these groups. These were outspoken political groups. Think about activist groups today and how only a small portion of the population belongs to them. That doesn't mean anyone is wrong or ignorant. It just means that the majority of people are more wrapped up in their daily lives than in politics. Let's first dive into what the Pharisees believed. Rather than accepting the culture and religion of the Greeks, these Jews insisted on knowing and obeying the law of their own God to the fullest extent possible. One of the difficulties with the law of Moses, however, is that in many places it is ambiguous. For example, Jews are told in the 10 Commandments to keep the Sabbath day holy, but nowhere does the Torah indicate precisely how this is to be done. Pharisees devised rules and regulations to assist them in keeping this and all the other laws of Moses. If we look at this belief from an unbiased perspective, the Pharisees were interested in ensuring they upheld their sacred duty. Remember, Judaism isn't about legalistically following a bunch of rules to get to heaven, which is the spin we were given. Judaism is instead about living life in a way that says thank you to Adonai for honoring the Jews. Adonai gave rules but didn't make them clear to us mere humans. The Pharisees wanted to make it clear exactly how to uphold those rules. Perhaps they were all autistic, because I kind of feel an affinity toward them. The other important thing to note is that in Jesus' day, the Pharisees had no political clout. They moved into a position of power several decades after his death. So when Jesus spoke to them, he wasn't speaking to oppressors, only a political activist group he may or may not have agreed with. They were on the same side, as it were, because they were all Jewish people being oppressed by the Roman state. At least at the time. Now let's talk about the Sadducees. Here we come to the group that was in league with the Romans. Most of the Sadducees were Jewish priests, and this group was cooperative with the Roman governor. They really didn't like all the rules the Pharisees were making. The Sadducees focused their religious attention on the sacrifice in the temple and expended their political energy on working out the relations with the Romans so that these sacrifices could continue. From their perspective, they were choosing the lesser of two evils. They needed to somewhat be in bed with the enemy, the Romans, so they could be allowed to continue their work for Adonai. I can see how that might be considered hypocritical to some of the Jews, but that's how politics works today. Concede some things over here in order to get the more important work done over there. Was it full of integrity and perfect morality? No, but again, that's what the lesser of two evils says. The third group within Judaism in Jesus' day was known as the Essenes. The Essenes were a group of Jews who lived isolated from the rest of society in an area known as Qumran. They were upset that one of the invaders had put the wrong bloodline in charge of the temple, so they lived apart and kept the Mosaic law rigorously. Also, they did so fully expecting the apocalypse of the end of time to be imminent. When it came, there would be a final battle between the forces of good and evil, between the children of light and the children of darkness. The battle would climax with the triumph of God and the entry of his children into the blessed kingdom. There was a fourth and final philosophy that was never named by either the New Testament or the historian who wrote about it. It seemed to be several political groups who had this philosophy over time. One of the groups was known as the Sicarii, which comes from the Latin word for dagger, and later a group was simply known as the Zealots. I'm not going to comment on this fourth philosophy, but I will lay out their beliefs for your consideration. The view that characterized these sundry groups was that Israel had a right to its own land, a right that had been granted by God himself. Anyone who usurped that right and anyone who backed the usurper was to be opposed by violent means if necessary. There were assassinations and kidnappings of high-ranking Jewish officials who were thought to be in league with the Roman authorities. When we read in the New Testament about Jesus criticizing the Pharisees and the Sadducees, we can now put it in its proper historical context. We don't need to be making things up, like the people who taught us in our former churches did. His criticisms were specific to a time and place in history, and if we are ever to comment on it, we need to be very cognizant of all of those details.